Hey everybody, today we're going to be working through the respiratory system anatomy. This will be a little bit shorter lecture than we're used to, but we'll still get an opportunity to touch on a lot of the structures that are on your list. As usual, you're going to want to be able to identify these different structures within the complete anatomy software, and you can find the specific screens or the lecture for this within complete anatomy in the biology 325-326 class group. And then remember, you can search for the individual slides using that prefix RESP for respiratory, RESP, if you type that in. You'll have the respiratory system anatomy review quizzes that you can take as many times as you'd like. And remember, you can also take the other quizzes that Complete Anatomy provides for practice. But remember, with the practical, you can only access and take that once. And once you do, that is your final score for that practical. Continue to email those scores for me. That's been helpful. Along with respiratory anatomy, you also have the radiology images. There's some CTs of the lungs that are helpful. We won't be using those in the practicals, those images, but they're good review. And there's also some short videos provided that go over respiratory anatomy and function within the videos section. All right, let's kick it off here. Well, first of all, the respiratory system functions to move air in and out of the lungs and to exchange gases between the air and the blood. Oxygen that our cells need is going to diffuse from the lung into the capillaries, where it's carried to the different tissues by red blood cells. Carbon dioxide that's produced as a byproduct then diffuses from cells and is going to be carried to the lungs by the blood. And then it's going to diffuse across those alveoli and is going to be exhaled. The respiratory system can be organized a couple different ways. We can do that structurally or functionally. So we're going to work through the structural organization first, in which case it's divided into the upper respiratory and the lower respiratory tract. So we'll see we got this division here that would occur across the neck. We can see the upper is made up of the nose, the associated nasal cavity, and the pharynx, or the throat. Then the lower respiratory tract consists of the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and then if we move a little deeper here, we can see it also consists of the alveolar ducts and the sacs where gas exchange occurs, the alveoli. Now let's take a look at the functional organization. Now, functionally, we can break the respiratory tract up into whether those zones are conducting air, which means just allowing air to pass. They help conduct air, transport air, or whether those zones are involved in the exchange of gases that occur deeper within the lungs. So we can see it's divided into the conducting zone, so that's air passageways, and the respiratory zone, and that's where gas exchange occurs. So the conducting zone, that consists of everything from the nose down to the terminal bronchioles, shown here. And then the respiratory zone are the areas where gas exchange occurs, which include the alveolar ducts and the alveoli. The respiratory mucosa is the mucosa that makes up the lining of the respiratory tract. And it consists of an epithelial layer. Let's see, I'll get my marker here. Right here, that sits on top of a basement membrane, and then there's generally a lamina propria, a thin layer of areolar connective tissue beneath that. Okay, so this is our mucosal layer, and if we look at this illustrated slide here that I just marked up, we can see these large goblet cells within them, or they're calling them mucus cells here. Goblet cells produce mucus, and that mucus helps trap dust and other foreign particles that are going to enter your respiratory tract. Now also notice that these are highly ciliated for the most part, most of the respiratory mucosa. And what this acts to do is the cilia on the apical side of those epithelial cells, they can act as a mucus escalator. So that's a term I stole from Clark here, and that's those cilia beat together to work up that mucus with the foreign particles that are trapped in them, and then it can be coughed up to be eliminated. And there's a general trend that we see with the respiratory epithelium, And that is the mucosal layer becomes progressively thinner as you move through the conducting zones. So that's where air is moving through into the respiratory zones where the gas exchange occurs. So you can see here, if we start out within the nasal cavity, for example, we're going to have very thick epithelial layer, thick respiratory mucosa. And then as we move down to the conducting zones, for example, if we move into the alveoli, we can see it's a very thin layer, simple squamous epithelium. That's more efficient for gas exchange. The exception would be areas along the respiratory tract that experience high abrasion. So those areas won't really follow this rule of thick to thin. And that's because here we're going to see there's going to be these stratified layers of squamous epithelium, and they help prevent against abrasion. So for example, let's talk about the oropharynx, right? So you masticated and chewed up all that food within your mouth, and that's high abrasion when you go to swallow that. So we'll add some protection by having this stratified layers of squamous epithelium. We said that structurally, we can divide the respiratory tract into the upper and lower tracts. So let's start with some anatomy of the upper respiratory tract. And we'll begin with the nose. The nose is primarily made up of cartilage, as we can see here. And then above that, superior to that, we have the nasal bones, and that gives us the bridge of the nose, susceptible to breaking. And we breathe air in through the nares, or the nostril of the nose, which leads into the nasal cavity. The green doesn't show up too well there, into the nasal cavity. Notice your complete anatomy link here. The nasal cavity begins at the nares and extends to the choanine. Okay? So we have external nares, which are our nostrils, and we have internal nares, which are the choanine. These are paired openings that lead into the nasopharynx, the choanine. You can also see here they're showing with this light blue color that the nasal cavity is divided by the nasal septum. So it's a membrane there. If you've ever heard of a deviated septum, that just means it's pushed off to one side more than the other. But that's the septum that divides the nasal cavity. So next we have the pharynx, or what we commonly call the throat. And it is divided up into three different sections, the nasal, oro, and laryngopharynx. Okay. So we just finished up with the nasal cavity, so let's work through. If we move to the nasal cavity, we enter into the nasopharynx. Okay, that prefix tells us that it's associated with the nasal cavity. Okay. Next, we'll move into the oropharynx, associated with the oral cavity. And then we have the laryngopharynx, associated with the larynx, or our voice box. So those are the three sections. The walls are composed of skeletal muscle, and they form this funnel-shaped passageway. Now, the oro and laryngopharynx, they're passageways for both air and food. You can imagine if you chew up some food within your mouth and then swallow, it'll pass through the oro and laryngopharynx. Now, the nasopharynx, that should be just air. But we all know there's an exception if you're drinking a soda and you laugh or something and then you get that fluid up into your nasal cavity. Again, note your complete anatomy links here. All right, the next structure we encounter is the larynx, or the voice box. This is a cylindrical airway between the laryngopharynx and the trachea, so it's a passageway for air. Notably, it prevents ingested material from entering the respiratory tract, and there's the epiglottis that would cover this superior opening to prevent that material from entering when swallowing. This also, importantly, produces sound, or what we call phonation, for speech. And it is our vocal folds that give rise to sound production, or we just said phonation. And this occurs when the vocal folds vibrate. So I'm going to point these out right here. These are vocal folds. Material right here, and then the rima glottis is this opening between them that can narrow or widen. Okay, so these vocal folds, they're called our true vocal cords, and they're very elastic. And when air moves through this rima glottis, they vibrate. Okay, so we can narrow or expand this area here to give a different phonation. And we can see that on the side here we have these vestibular folds, and these are called false vocal cords. They basically prevent material from entering the trachea, and they're not very elastic at all. I just want to point out some of the cartilages you need to know for the larynx. I haven't come up with a good mnemonic yet. They all kind of start with a C, so it's a little tricky. I guess that's not entirely true, but because we're going to start out with a T. Here we have the thyroid cartilage, and this gives rise to the Adam's apple. So here we have an interior view of the larynx. And then we already mentioned the cricoid cartilages here that make up these rings. Okay. Then if we flip to a posterior view, we can see that we have a cuneiform cartilage, and then inferior to that we have the corniculate cartilage, and then inferior to that the arytenoid cartilage. Okay. And then we can also see the cricoid cartilage again on the posterior side. And finally, we have our trachea, or commonly called the windpipe. And this is an open tube that connects the larynx that we just talked about to the bronchi. So here we have our right and our left bronchus. So collectively, plural, we call them the bronchi. It sits anterior to the esophagus, but posterior to the sternum, so it gets protection from the sternum there. And it's about 13 inches long. Okay. Here we have the rings of tracheal cartilage. Okay. Those lend support to the trachea. It helps hold it open. It would be a bad thing if your trachea were to collapse, as it's an airway. We can also see some previously discussed cartilages. Your thyroid cartilage gives rise to that Adam's apple, and then the cricoid cartilage associated with the larynx. The tracheal cartilage, those rings are connected by these annular ligaments that are found between them. And I think that's it. Here we have a histology prep, a slide here showing a cross section through the trachea. You can see here is our lumen, the hollow center within this portion of the trachea. So then, of course, we have our mucosal layer that lines the respiratory tract. And then we can see here we have some tracheal cartilage that adds support to that trachea so it doesn't collapse. Then we can also see some smooth muscle associated with the trachea.